Good afternoon, everyone. This is Remco Fischer here. I'm the climate change lead at UNEP Finance Initiative. I hope you're all enjoying and taking great advantage from this regional roundtable for Europe that you're participating at. COP26 is probably the most important intergovernmental meeting on the environment and sustainability, not only of this year, but I believe of this entire commencing decade in front of us. It is taking place in Glasgow at the moment, Scotland, and scheduled to end already COB tomorrow, Friday. So what better timing to give you all an update on where things stand in Glasgow coming out of COP than now. Before focusing on COP and the current negotiations, let me take you quickly through what is the broader context within which COP is taking place at the moment. So the context through which the world went and world governments went into COP. After COVID-related reduction in global CO2 emissions in 2020, in 2021, this year, they have fully rebounded back and are almost back at the same level as 2019. There is no expectation that the COVID crisis nor the ensuing stimulus packages that were put in place responding to the crisis will have reduced emissions permanently. This is in stark contrast, of course, to what we need to stay on a 1.5 degree pathway, which is an annual reduction of global emissions by roughly 7%, again, every year starting now. This means also that we need to halve global emissions by 2030 if we are to be able to limit the mean global temperature increase to 1.5 by the end of the century. Ahead of COP, many countries going into COP had already submitted their updated short to medium-term country plans on climate, the so-called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, with many of these NDCs being more ambitious than what countries had submitted earlier, the first generation of NDCs. But still, even this latest generation of NDCs is not ambitious enough. Still, the current body of NDCs that were submitted for COP would take the world to warming of 2.7 degrees by 2100, so almost triple the amount of warming that we have now in 2021, which is 1.1 degrees, and double almost the amount of warming that is considered to be safe by most scientists. So against that a little pessimistic background, what do we see perhaps as being some of the silver linings on the horizon? The silver linings that are coming out of COP, or perhaps that are being reinforced at COP. One silver lining is that to date, as of today, I believe over 120 countries covering a significant majority of the world's emissions have communicated, many during COP over the last 2 weeks, a carbon neutrality objective, so a net zero emissions target. Most of these targets are to be attained by 2050, but some major emerging economies are giving themselves a little bit more time, such as China, whose target is by 2060, and India, whose target is by 2070. India's target was announced just about a week ago in Glasgow. If all of those net zero objectives by countries were to be truly delivered on time, the expected temperature outcome, of course, would adjust significantly. Not enough, but significantly. It seems initial calculations are showing something around 1.9 degrees of warming. Again, this is assuming that the entirety of countries' net zero commitments are fully delivered. The main challenge that we see here at the moment is that those long-term net zero objectives of countries are not yet consistent, they're not yet in sync with the shorter term and medium term plans, the NDCs. There's a disconnect between what countries say they want to do in the long term by the middle of the century and what they are submitting in documents in terms of their shorter term plans by 2030. And of course, this raises serious questions It's always good to have a long-term objective, but how much is that worth if the nearer-term targets, strategies, and plans don't add up to that? What are other silver linings that we see going into COP and coming out of COP? One really comes from the private sector. Private sector commitments to net zero, and also including, importantly, commitments to net zero coming from the finance sector. There are now 4,000 businesses who, through the Race to Zero, have committed to aligning their business models not only with net zero by 2050, but also into alignment with 1.5. When it comes to the finance sector, which all of you are, of course, a part of, there are now over 400 financial institutions worldwide in the various alliances that make up GFANZ. GFANZ is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, convened and chaired by Mark Carney. 3 of the alliances within GFANZ, as many of you will know, are convened and facilitated by UNEP-FI. First, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, that in 6 months has grown to over 90 members with over $60 trillion in assets. Second, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, that is co-convened by UNEP-FI and the PRI, with 61 members now and $10 trillion in assets. And then thirdly, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Unlike the net zero pledges coming from countries, financial institutions in these alliances are also committing to near-term action and to intermediary targets that, of course, have to add up and have to be consistent with the long-term objective of net zero by 2050. For instance, 2 weeks ago, ahead of COP, half of the members of the Asset Owner Alliance already published their science-based 1.5 aligned portfolio decarbonization targets that are to be achieved already by 2025. Those targets coming out of the Asset Owner Alliance are, in my opinion, the first tangible, concrete output coming out of the net zero finance agenda, and that, of course, being a significant input and contribution to COP26. In addition to these private sector contributions at COP, what were other noteworthy announcements over the last 2 weeks? Yesterday, the world's 2 largest emitters, China and the US, announced that they would immediately resume close collaboration again to reduce emissions on both sides of the Pacific, in line with their corresponding net zero commitments, which for the US is by 2050 and for China is by 2060. This is a huge political signal to the rest of the world. On deforestation, over 100 countries representing about 85% of the world's forest cover promised to stop deforestation by 2030. This commitment was also boosted by an announcement coming from the finance sector, where over 30 financial institutions committed to fully stopping investing into activities linked to deforestation. This is typically production of agricultural commodities. On methane, more than 100 countries agreed to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030, which is considerable. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas alongside CO2, and at this moment responsible for about 30% of the warming that we see. On coal, more than 40 countries, which include major coal users such as Poland, Vietnam, and Chile, agreed to shift away from it. Other countries, though, who rely on coal, either for their own electricity production or for exporting, are not a part of this. This includes Australia, China, among many other countries. On the internal combustion engine and mobility, 24 countries in a group of the largest car manufacturers committed to ending the era of fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2040. From that moment onwards, they will sell within their territories only zero emissions vehicles onwards. China, Germany, and the US, though, are not a part of this commitment. Now, all of these commitments that I've just enumerated, they don't come from all countries, so they're not formal COP outcomes. They are made by subgroups of countries coming together at COP often together with the private sector, which is very promising, on very specific topics and challenges such as methane and deforestation, etc. Let me, to conclude, now turn to what is just now, at this moment, materializing as the draft formal communique to be adopted by all countries as the formal COP26 outcome. Hopefully, this will be fully adopted by COB tomorrow. This draft was yesterday tabled by the UK as the COP president. This is not going to be a new treaty like the one that came out of Paris in 2015, but it will contain a number of very important decisions that help implement the Paris Accord. These decisions, though, will have legal force in the context of the Paris Agreement. So this is going to be a very powerful document. What do we see as the most significant provisions in this current draft? I think there are three key items here. First, there is strongest language than in any other COP decision before on the scientific imperative to stay within the 1.5 degree boundary and to explicitly reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to the levels in 2010. Number two, the probably most significant provision in the document so far, if adopted, would request that all countries already in 2022, next year, further update their NDCs, especially within the NDCs regarding their targets, their decarbonization targets by 2030. The point here being, again, that currently the short-term targets don't add up to the longer-term objective. And this provision is aiming to close that gap. Without this provision, countries would be expected to submit their next generation of NDCs only by 2025, and the world would lose 5 precious years on climate ambition, which we all know it does not have. Third, for the first time in COP history, a formal document, again, we're talking here about a draft at the moment. So if adopted, if that draft were to be adopted, would call explicitly on all countries to phase out coal as the #1 cause of climate change. It would also explicitly call on all countries to phase out subsidies, public subsidies to all fossil fuels, including coal, but also beyond. If these 3 points were to become adopted in the final draft of the document, most commentators agree this would be a great outcome from Glasgow. But of course, as I said, negotiations are ongoing. They will continue at least until tomorrow, even if not all the way until Saturday morning. So stay tuned. And of course, as UNEP-FI, we will continue to keeping you updated. Thank you very much. And I hope you continue enjoying the Regional Roundtable.